Eva sat by the window, gazing out at the quiet street below. The early morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. Her son, Liam, was still asleep in the other room, his small chest rising and falling with the rhythmic breath of innocence. Eva sighed, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her coffee cup. The house was still, too still, as if the world outside had forgotten her. The weight of the decision she had made months ago pressed heavily on her chest. The adoption. The thought still haunted her. Had she pushed too hard? She told herself it was for the best, that Liam needed a stable, secure life. And James had seemed so willing at the time, so eager to step in and offer that future. But now, with his sudden departure, she wasn't so sure. James had been her rock for so long. At least, that's how it felt at first. She had never expected to fall in love with him. He was older, more established, with a life she could only dream of. The kind of life she could never offer her son, not on her own. But when James had entered their world, everything changed. Liam had taken to him immediately, and Eva had found herself believing that maybe this was the break she'd been waiting for. Maybe James could be the one to make everything right. But now, here she was alone, with Liam, and with nothing but mounting bills and the relentless worry gnawing at her. James had disappeared 2 weeks ago, without a word. No phone call, no explanation. Just gone. Eva could still hear the echo of his voice in her mind. I need some space, Eva. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. His words had seemed so distant, so unlike the man she had come to depend on. At first, she had tried to be understanding, giving him the time he said he needed. But then the silence stretched on, longer than she ever expected. His absence felt like a storm cloud hanging over her, and every day without him was a little harder to bear. She glanced at the adoption papers on the kitchen counter. The signed documents were a testament to the promise she thought they had made together. She had pushed him to sign them. At the time, she thought it was the right thing to do. But now, with him gone, she was left to deal with the consequences alone. Eva had never been good with money. It was something she had always struggled with even before Liam was born. Her family had never been wealthy, and as a young adult, she had been careless with her finances, spending money she didn't have. It had taken years to climb out of debt, but even now, it was always a delicate balance. Bills piled up, and the fear of losing everything was a constant companion. When she met James, things had seemed different. He was successful, rich, even, and he had a certain charm that made her believe everything could finally be okay. He told her that he wanted to help her, to build a life together. Eva was skeptical at first, but he seemed genuine. And as time went on, she had come to rely on him more than she cared to admit. But now, with his sudden disappearance, everything was falling apart. She couldn't even afford Liam's daycare anymore, let alone the rent for their apartment. She hadn't heard from James, not even a text. No calls. Just a cold emptiness where his presence used to be. She had tried to contact his family, but they were just as evasive. His sister, Rachel, told her that she had no idea where James was, that she hadn't spoken to him in weeks. Eva's mind raced. Where had he gone? Why hadn't he come back? The unanswered questions gnawed at her, growing louder with each passing day. But there was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The more she thought about it, the more she began to wonder if there was something more to his disappearance than just a need for space. She had trusted him, let him into her life and Liam's life. But had he ever really been sincere? Had he been using her all along? The thought made her stomach churn, but she couldn't ignore the possibility. She had seen the way he'd handled his finances. The way he spoke about his family, with disdain and distance. It all seemed too perfect, too calculated. Was it possible that the adoption had been part of some bigger plan? A plan she had unwittingly become a part of? Eva pushed the thought away. She couldn't afford to think like that. Not now. What mattered was Liam, and making sure he was taken care of. But the fear crept in again, whispering in the back of her mind. What if she had made a terrible mistake? She shook her head, trying to dispel the doubt. She had to focus on the present, on the immediate problem. Money. Rent. Bills. She needed a solution, and she needed it fast. But with no help from James, no support from her family, she was on her own. And the weight of that reality felt heavier than ever. The sound of Liam's footsteps echoed from the hallway, and she quickly wiped away the tears that had begun to form in her eyes. She couldn't let him see her like this. Not now. She forced a smile as he walked into the room, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "Mommy," he mumbled, his voice soft and innocent. "Hey, sweetie," Eva said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Did you sleep well?" Liam nodded, yawning. "Can we have breakfast?" Eva bent down to scoop him up, her heart breaking at the sight of his trusting face. He didn't know the weight of the world that was pressing down on her, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending everything was okay. "Of course," she said, kissing his forehead. "Let's make some pancakes." As she carried him to the kitchen, her thoughts drifted back to James. Was he gone for good? Would he ever come back? And if he didn't, what would she do? How would she survive without him? The questions haunted her, but there was no time to dwell on them. Not while Liam needed her. Not while the bills were piling up, and the walls were closing in. There was only one thing left to do, figure out a way to make it all work, even if it meant facing a truth she wasn't ready to accept. Eva stared at the pile of unopened bills on the counter. The numbers swam before her eyes, blurring together in a haze of red and black. Each letter was a reminder that the life she had built, the life she had dreamed of, was falling apart at the seams. She picked up a utility bill, her hands shaking as she tried to make sense of the amount owed. Another late payment. Another reminder that time was running out. She hadn't heard from James in over 2 weeks. The silence was suffocating. At first, she had hoped he just needed some time to himself, some space to clear his head. But now, as the days dragged on, hope was fading. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air, leaving no trace behind. His phone went straight to voicemail, his emails went unanswered. It was like he had erased himself from her life completely. The thought gnawed at her. Why would he leave like this? Why hadn't he said anything? She couldn't help but wonder if it had anything to do with the adoption. Had she pushed him too hard? Was he overwhelmed by the responsibility of becoming a father? The guilt twisted in her stomach. She had wanted the best for Liam. She had pushed James into this, believing it would give them both a chance at a better life. But now it felt like a betrayal. Eva pushed the thought aside, unable to deal with it just yet. She needed to focus on the present, on the bills that were piling up and the rent that was due in a few days. She couldn't afford to sit around feeling sorry for herself. There was work to be done. She grabbed her phone and dialed the number of her landlord. It rang 3 times before a voice on the other end answered. "Hello? Hi, this is Eva. I was wondering if there's any way I could extend the rent payment for another week. I'm a little behind, but I'll have the money soon." There was a long pause before the landlord responded, his tone cold. "Eva, I've been patient with you for months now. You've been late more than once. You're pushing it. I know, Eva said quickly. I'm sorry, but I'm doing the best I can. Just one more week, please. I'll make sure it's paid. The landlord sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. Fine, but this is the last time. I can't keep giving you extensions. Make sure you get it to me by next week, or I'll have no choice but to start the eviction process. Her heart sank. She couldn't afford to lose the apartment. It was the only place she and Liam had. The thought of having to find a new home, of trying to navigate through a world that felt like it was crumbling around her, was too much to bear. Thank you, Eva managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She hung up the phone and placed it on the counter, her hands trembling. She turned to the living room, where Liam was playing with his toys, completely unaware of the weight of the situation. She wished she could shield him from it all, from the mounting pressure, the stress that was slowly consuming her. But she knew she couldn't. Not anymore. She tried to take a deep breath, but it felt like the air was too thick to breathe in. The bills, the unanswered questions about James, the nagging feeling that something wasn't right, it all crashed down on her at once. She needed answers. She needed to understand why he had left, and what he had been hiding. Her thoughts turned to Rachel, James' sister. They had never been particularly close, but Rachel had always been friendly. Maybe she knew something. Maybe she could shed some light on where James had gone or what was really going on. Without thinking, Eva grabbed her coat and keys, making her way out the door. The cold air hit her face as she stepped outside, but she welcomed the sharpness, the clarity it brought. She didn't want to sit around anymore, waiting for things to change on their own. She had to take control. Rachel's apartment was only a few blocks away, and Eva made the walk quickly, her mind racing. What if Rachel didn't know anything? What if this was just another dead end? But she had to try. She couldn't let the silence consume her any longer. When she arrived at Rachel's building, she rang the buzzer, the sharp sound echoing in the stillness. A few moments later, Rachel's voice came through the intercom. Eva? What's going on? I need to talk to you, Eva replied, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. It's about James. There was a pause before Rachel buzzed her in. Eva climbed the stairs, her heart pounding with each step. She knocked on the door, and after a moment, Rachel opened it, her expression guarded. Eva, what's going on? Rachel asked, stepping aside to let her in. I don't know where he is, Eva said, her voice trembling. I haven't heard from James in weeks. He just left. Rachel's face shifted slightly, as if she were trying to suppress something. Eva noticed the subtle change, the way Rachel's eyes flickered, but she didn't say anything. She had to know the truth. Do you know where he went? Eva pressed, her gaze steady. Rachel hesitated, her lips pressing together as if she were weighing her words. Finally, she sighed. He didn't tell me, Rachel said quietly. But I think he needed some time to figure things out. He was stressed, you know? The whole adoption thing was a lot for him. Maybe too much. Eva's stomach churned. The adoption. She had pushed James into it, convinced it was the right decision. But now, it felt like it was all unraveling, like she had made a mistake that would cost them everything. Was there something else going on? Eva asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel seemed to struggle with her response, her eyes darting to the floor before meeting Eva's gaze again. I think James had some stuff he was dealing with. Stuff he didn't want to tell you about. He's always been kind of secretive about his family, his business. There's more to it than you know. Eva's heart skipped a beat. What kind of stuff? Rachel shook her head. I don't know, Eva. I don't think he was ever as ready for all of this as you thought. And he didn't want to disappoint you. Eva felt a sharp sting in her chest. She had pushed him, maybe too hard. And now, it felt like everything was crumbling around her. Where is he? Eva demanded, her voice breaking. What is he hiding? Rachel looked away, her jaw tight. I can't say. But I think you need to prepare yourself. I don't think he's coming back. Eva stood frozen, the words sinking in, and for the first time since James left, she felt completely, utterly alone. Eva stood motionless in Rachel's apartment, the weight of Rachel's words settling like a heavy fog around her. She had come for answers, but now, in the face of silence and evasiveness, she was left with more questions than ever. He's not coming back. Those words echoed in her mind, reverberating through the stillness of the room. The man she had trusted, the man she had pushed into adopting her child, was gone. And what did Rachel mean by he didn't want to disappoint you? Had she been nothing more than a pawn in James' game? Her breath caught in her throat, a tightness wrapping around her chest. The adoption, had been the thread that connected them, that had made her feel like she had a future, a chance at something better. She had pushed James to make that commitment, believing it would be their ticket to stability. And now, with everything crumbling around her, it felt like a cruel joke. I need to go, Eva said, her voice barely a whisper, the words slipping out like a confession she didn't want to make. Rachel didn't respond, only nodding as she stepped aside to let Eva pass. The door clicked shut behind her, and she descended the stairs slowly, her mind numb, her heart heavy with an unbearable mix of emotions. She walked through the streets, the world moving around her in a blur. The cold air felt sharper now, biting into her skin, but she hardly noticed. How did I get here? She had spent so many years building a life, hoping for something more for her son, and now she was staring into the abyss of her own decisions. She had trusted James, trusted him when he said he wanted to build a family, to take care of her and Liam. But it had all been a lie, hadn't it? The adoption had been a means to an end, and she had been too blinded by desperation to see it. Eva stopped in front of their apartment building, her fingers gripping the railing as she stared up at the window to their little home. The place that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt suffocating. She could almost hear Liam's laughter from inside, but it only reminded her of how fragile everything had become. How easily it could all slip away. It was then that a thought struck her, something she had almost dismissed, something that had been hovering on the edges of her mind ever since Rachel had mentioned James' business dealings. There's more to it than you know. The words resounded with a clarity that made Eva's pulse quicken. Could there be something hidden in James' past? Some connection, some financial entanglement, that explained his sudden departure? She made a decision. If she was going to survive this, if she was going to make sure Liam had a future, she needed answers. Not just from Rachel, but from the source itself. James' business dealings, his family, everything he had hidden, she was going to uncover it all. That night, after putting Liam to bed, Eva sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. She had always been good at digging through information, piecing things together when the pieces didn't quite fit. And this time, she wasn't going to stop until she had the full picture. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she searched through James' name, pulling up everything she could find. It wasn't long before something caught her eye, an old business deal, a partnership with a company that Eva had never heard of before. The deal seemed simple on the surface, but the more she read, the more it began to feel off. There were financial discrepancies, irregular transactions, and a list of people involved, people she didn't recognize but whose names kept popping up in connection with James. The puzzle pieces clicked together in her mind. James had always been secretive about his business affairs, about his family. And now, as she uncovered more details, it became clear that his sudden disappearance wasn't a coincidence. The adoption, the finances, everything had been part of a much bigger plan. Eva wasn't just some naive woman caught up in a romantic fantasy. She had been drawn into a financial scheme, a carefully orchestrated move to secure his own future at the expense of hers. The truth was unbearable, but it was clear. James hadn't disappeared because he was overwhelmed by fatherhood. He had disappeared because he had gotten what he wanted. The adoption, the bond with Liam, it was all a means to an end. A legal way to solidify his position, to tie himself to her and her son in a way that couldn't be undone. He had used her, and now, when the deal was done, he had left her to deal with the fallout. Eva sat back in her chair, the room spinning around her as she tried to process what she had just uncovered. She wanted to scream, to rage at the injustice of it all. But the reality of the situation settled in, cold and unforgiving. She had to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. James was never coming back, and she was on her own. A sharp knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, making her jump. She stood quickly, her heart pounding in her chest, and opened the door to find Rachel standing on the other side. "I need to talk to you," Rachel said, her voice urgent. Eva blinked, surprised by her sudden appearance. "What is it?" "I didn't want to say this before," Rachel began, her voice shaky. "But I think you need to know everything. I've been keeping something from you." Eva stepped aside, her mind racing as she gestured for Rachel to enter. "What do you mean?" Rachel took a deep breath, her eyes flickering to the floor before she looked up at Eva again. James was in deep with his family's business. "You don't know everything about the inheritance, the will, and the deal he made. He's been using you, Eva." The adoption wasn't just about starting a family. It was a way to secure his position, to lock in the money. Eva felt her stomach drop as the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. "The adoption, the inheritance," she murmured, her voice distant. Rachel nodded, her face pale. "He manipulated the situation, Eva. I never wanted you to be part of it. But I was too scared to say anything, too scared of what might happen if I did." Eva felt a cold anger rise within her, mingled with a deep sense of betrayal. She had been a pawn, nothing more. James had used her, and she had been too blinded by her own desperation to see it. As Rachel spoke, Eva's thoughts shifted. She had lost everything, trust, love, security, but she wasn't going to let James win. Not like this. She wasn't going to let him take Liam's future away. "I'm done," Eva said, her voice sharp. "I'm done with him. And I'm done with all of this. I'll make sure Liam has a future, even if I have to do it on my own." Rachel looked at her, a mixture of guilt and sadness in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Eva. I should have told you sooner." Eva gave her a tight smile, her resolve hardening. "It's too late for apologies. But I'm done hiding. I'm going to fight for Liam. And I'm going to fight for myself." She closed the door behind Rachel, standing alone in the silence of the apartment. The world outside had changed, but Eva was no longer afraid. Whatever came next, she was ready. The game had shifted, and now, it was her turn.